Saint Patrick, the man, the myth, the legend. While Patrick's life and deeds are fascinating, they're often overshadowed by legend. What we know of Patrick comes from two kinds of writings. There are the two documents written by the man himself, the Confessio and his letter to Coroticus. Then there are the hagiographies. These are biographies and anecdotes written post-mortem by clerics who were advocating for Patrick's sainthood or retelling the stories of his miracles as a teaching tool. And of course, this is where the larger-than-life St. Patrick really comes from. So, let's run down the top 5 myths about St. Patrick and see how close to reality they come. Now, before we get started, I would very much appreciate it if you would consider subscribing and giving a like to this video to help us fight the algorithm. Thank you so much. The historic Patrick was born somewhere in England on a Roman-style farming estate or villa. Nobody is exactly sure where. As a young man of just 16 years, he was taken prisoner by Irish raiders and forced into slavery. For 6 years, he toiled as an animal herder before escaping and making his way home. His travels were long and took him all the way to France, where he was ordained. Later on, a vision told Patrick that he should return to Ireland to preach the word of God. He could hardly have guessed that he would one day be revered as one of the greatest Christian missionaries in history. Now, the most famous myth surrounding St. Patrick involves the symbol that he's most associated with, the Shamrock. According to the lore, Patrick would explain the Holy Trinity to his followers using a 3-leaf clover, with each leaf representing one part of the Trinity: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The story goes that Patrick used this method because the pagans he was trying to convert were illiterate, and a symbol taken from the wilderness they lived in was just more relatable. More so, theoretically, the natives had a tripartite god of their own, so the concept was easy to carry over. It's a good story, and makes Patrick out to be a very clever teacher, but it's completely fabricated. The words St. Patrick and Shamrock didn't appear together in any text until at least 7 centuries after he walked the earth. While the premise of the story itself is quite plausible, none of the writings that survive from Patrick's life even so much as mention the humble Shamrock being used as a teaching tool. The idea of Patrick doing so only appears in 12th century hagiographies. In those days, the church was trying its hardest to either erase or co-opt pagan practices. The Shamrock, therefore, may have been symbolic of tripartite deity concepts of the indigenous Irish, such as the Morrigan, or cosmic thinking, for instance, seeing the world as divided into earth, sea, and sky, or even 3 aspects of time: past, present, and future. Regardless of what the indigenous people thought of this symbol at the time, at some point somebody decided this might be an effective thing to use for future missionary work. Another one of Patrick's signature accessories, one he's almost always portrayed with, was his walking staff. This myth deals with how Patrick eventually lost that staff. As the story goes, Patrick often got homesick while on his missionary travels in Ireland. He wrote numerous remarks about his desire to return to his family, in fact. Well, on the day he was set to finally sail back home, Patrick suddenly became worried that the Irish people would forget the lessons he had preached to them. His solution was to take his trusty staff and shove it into the ground. As soon as he did so, roots sprouted from the staff. The once dead wood grew and grew into a mighty tree, a miracle that showed the power of God and the truth of Patrick's words, which should not be forgotten. Other versions of this story tell of Patrick encountering the legendary mythological Irish figure Oisin the poet. Oisin, himself something of a magical being, was the son of the ancient and mighty hero Finn McCool. And as that story goes, Oisin had been feeling homesick for Ireland after his time in the realm of faerie. He decided to return to Ireland for a visit. And, well, his journey there didn't really go all that well, but he had the good fortune of meeting St. Patrick on the road one day. The two men got into a long, deep discussion about religion, life, death, the afterlife. Oisin was beginning to become convinced that maybe this Christianity thing was a good idea, but he wanted some proof. So he demanded that St. Patrick perform a miracle. Patrick happily complied. He took his staff and thrust it into the earth, where it immediately grew into a beautiful tree. And Oisin was, of course, duly impressed. Now, this version of the staff story in particular is of a type we often see in the medieval period, the debate or battle between a powerful pagan and a powerful Christian, with the Christian always winning and the community immediately converting to Christianity afterwards. Usually the pagans are represented by some sort of shaman or witch, so the idea that Oisin himself returned from Faerie to discuss life and death with Patrick is kind of an epic match. When did the staff story first originate? Well, again, it was probably created in the 12th century when the church was writing their hagiography of Patrick. The meeting with Oisin was certainly a folk tale which was invented even later on. And speaking of the 12th century hagiography, another wonderful bit of lore contained there is the story of how Patrick even employed the dead to assist in his conversions. We are told that at one point Patrick was dealing with a particularly ornery and stubborn group of pagans, and they just weren't buying into the sermon. So Patrick decided to take a different approach. He thought to himself, who better to testify to the pagans about the truth of the afterlife than people who had actually experienced it? People who found out about heaven firsthand but weren't allowed in. Ah, that's a great idea. Patrick proceeded to resurrect a recently deceased pagan, who then gave the congregation the ultimate fire and brimstone sermon about how horrible death was if you were outside of God's grace. Everyone was awestruck. Well, not everyone. A few skeptics thought Patrick was doing a sort of a bait-and-switch magic trick, so they decided to pull a sting operation. One of them pretended to be dead, and the rest begged Patrick to resurrect him on the spot. But Patrick was too clever for them. He prayed so hard that the faker actually did die, right in front of the group. Everyone converted to Christianity on the spot, and afterwards Patrick brought their friend back to life. Now that is what I call entertainment. Probably the most famous of the myths surrounding St. Patrick is the one about him banishing all the snakes from Ireland. The story basically goes like this. When Patrick returned to Ireland as a missionary, one of the first things he did was to climb to the top of a lonely mountain in County Mayo, now known as Crio Patrick. Here, he was determined to meditate and pray for guidance on how to conduct his mission. Now, this was during Lent, so Patrick had also been fasting for 40 days and nights as he traveled, a miraculous accomplishment in and of itself. The first challenge that came was a gang of crow-like demons who accosted him as he tried to ascend the mountain. Patrick prayed to God to send these birds away, and eventually, they actually evaporated right out of the sky. Later on his journey back down the mountain, a huge pit, a teeming nest of evil serpents appeared on the path right in front of Patrick. But he was having none of it. He launched into a righteous fury and chased the snakes all the way into the ocean, from whence they never returned. Thus, no snakes can be found in Ireland to this day. Is it just a myth? Well, yeah, it's definitely a myth. In fact, Patrick himself wrote about a few miracles he performed, or he would say experienced, in his lifetime. But this was not one of them. In fact, scientists have no proof that snakes ever reside in Ireland to begin with. Now, the story has become a little controversial in recent years because it is taken as a metaphor for Patrick removing all of the pagans from Ireland. And this started not too long ago. In the book Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, published back in 1911, the author theorizes that perhaps the banishing of the snakes was meant to be a metaphor for the banishing of the pagans. After all, snakes were used in Christianity to symbolize dark practices, sin, and devilry, and snakes were a common motif in pagan culture as well. But again, this is all loose conjecture. The story comes in later writing about St. Patrick, where his persona had taken on a more, let's say, active approach in his conversions. His driving out of pagans in these writings was often stated very literally in the text, so a metaphor being mixed in is very implausible. The simple answer is the most correct in this case. The story was written to demonstrate the power of St. Patrick's faith while also serving as an explainer myth, a folk tale of why snakes don't exist in Ireland. So continuing with the theme of paganism, Patrick was often painted as a holy crusader in Ireland. Some claim he single-handedly drove out or converted all the pagans in the land. And again, most of these claims come from later hagiographies that tend to paint Patrick in a fantastical light. These stories also perpetuate the idea that Patrick was violent, or at the very least, very active in driving out pagans in Ireland. For instance, one anecdote claims that Patrick burned hundreds of pagan books to stop the spread of the religion. This almost certainly didn't happen, since the indigenous Irish did not rely on the written word to pass on customs and beliefs. They were a tribal society using oral tradition. And society-wide conversion was actually a very slow process, and one that probably flowed from the nobility downwards. Records seem to indicate that many druids, the high echelon spiritual and political leaders of Ireland, actually became priests of the new religion over time. And of course, many sources point to paganism being actively practiced in the centuries following St. Patrick's time in the land, albeit on a diminished scale. Nevertheless, they were there, and this caused the church some consternation. The old beliefs were then preserved in the form of folk religion and superstitions, including the so-called fairy faith observed by people to this very day. So here we are. It seems that most of the really cool stories we have about Patrick were invented as sort of, well, fan fiction, I would say. Historians like Dr. Julian Osborne McKnight, author of The Story We Carry in Our Bones, Irish History for Americans, document the process. Patrick's principal biographers, two monks named Tirashan and Murasho, as well as many later hagiographers, mythologized Patrick into a sort of a super saint, a man who fought with druids, used shamrocks to teach the Trinity, and drove the snakes out of Ireland. In fact, Patrick was not the first Christian missionary to come to Ireland. That honor most likely falls to Palladius, who came several decades before St. Patrick's trip. The best glimpse of who Patrick really was comes in his own autobiography, the Confessio, which is usually translated as the Confession or the Declaration. This document was written as a defense against other Christian clerics who were criticizing Patrick's work and his faith. In it, Patrick comes across as a humble, self-conscious individual. The first line states, "My name is Patrick. I am a sinner, a simple country person, and the least of all believers." Patrick's writing is crude, showing he lacked a thorough, highborn sort of education. Patrick scholar D.A. Binchy puts it, "The moral and spiritual greatness of the man shines through every stumbling sentence of his rustic Latin."
I know for certain that before I was humbled, I was like a stone lying in a deep mire. And he that is mighty came and in his mercy raised me up, and indeed lifted me up high and placed me on top of the wall. And from there I ought to shout out in gratitude to the Lord for his great favors in this world and forever, that the mind of man cannot measure.
Patrick seems to grapple with feelings of inadequacy. Though he mentions having performed at least 1,000 conversions, he feels he has not accomplished enough. He describes himself as merely a peaceful preacher, alone in the land. And indeed he was. His writings document how he was often at odds with the local chieftains, who resented Patrick's refusal to accept their gifts. He was beaten and robbed at least once. When he witnessed the poor treatment of newly made Irish Christians, he tried to plead on their behalf. And for this and other things, he was ostracized by most of Irish society. However, Patrick was always honest and direct with his beliefs. He was not a perfect man, by his own admission. He was a man who pushed himself to be better, despite all the obstacles that were laid in front of him. And frankly, I find that more inspiring than any of the myths. Whether you're of Irish descent or not, there's a great lesson to be learned from Patrick. Namely, that humility, determination, empathy, and faith can allow you to change the world, even if maybe you don't quite see how it turns out in your own lifetime. Thank you for joining me for a little bit of storytelling. Now, if you grew up with stories of St. Patrick, I would love to know which story is your favorite or how you heard it first. Tell us in the comments below. And if you're interested in Irish culture and kilts and history, we have a playlist right over here. And again, if you don't mind subscribing and giving us a like on this video, it would help us to do more stuff like this in the future. Have a great day.